I was the naive girl who believed love could conquer everything until the man I trusted shattered my world. When I died, betrayed and broken, I thought it was over. But fate had other plans. Now, reborn with all my memories intact, I've returned to the moment before everything fell apart. This time, I won't be the victim. This time, I'll make them pay for every lie, every betrayal. And maybe, just maybe, I'll learn what it truly means to be free. I remember the day I died with the kind of clarity you can't escape. My hands were trembling, stained with the ink of a contract that stripped away everything I'd worked for. He stood there, the man I'd loved since I was 16, looking at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I'd never seen eyes so cold. "You were always too soft," he said. His voice was quiet, almost bored. "That's why this was so easy." And then the darkness came. When I opened my eyes again, I thought maybe I'd passed onto some cruel afterlife. But as my vision cleared, I realized I was lying in my childhood bedroom, the same pale curtains fluttering in the early spring breeze. My hands were smooth again. My heart was still racing. And when I sat up, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. April 3rd, exactly 1 year before everything was stolen from me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I pressed my palm over my heart, feeling a thud beneath my ribs. The universe had given me a second chance. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or scream. A dozen memories collided in my mind. Every whispered conversation I hadn't understood back then, every false smile that had hidden the knives behind my back. And his face. God, his face. The man I'd loved so blindly, I hadn't even noticed he was dismantling my life piece by piece. I curled my fingers into the sheets. No more. This time, I'd be the one holding the knife. I stood and moved to the mirror. The girl who stared back looked soft, hopeful. I almost pitied her. But I wasn't her anymore. I pulled my hair back into a sleek ponytail, as if that alone could anchor me in this new reality. My mind was already racing, cataloging everything I'd need to do. First, I needed to distance myself from him. Slowly, so he wouldn't suspect. Then, I'd start gathering evidence. I knew exactly how he'd embezzled funds, which shell companies he'd hidden them in. And I knew the woman he'd secretly planned to marry after discarding me. The thought made something cold and focused settle in my chest. I would not be his stepping stone again. A knock came at my door. My mother's voice drifted through the crack. "Sweetheart? Are you awake?" I took a moment to smooth my expression, carefully crafting the gentle daughter she remembered. "Yes, Mom," I called back. "Just getting ready." She opened the door and smiled. I tried to ignore the pang in my chest. She didn't know how much she would hurt me later, siding with him out of ambition or fear or both. But I did. And that knowledge meant I could protect myself, and maybe even protect her from her own choices. "I thought we could have breakfast together," she said. "Sure." I forced my voice to stay even. As she walked away, I glanced at my phone again. Today was the day he'd first told me he loved me. The day he'd begun laying the foundation for my destruction. I closed my eyes, breathed out slowly. Not this time. When I walked downstairs, I knew exactly who I was. A woman reborn. A woman with a plan. And a woman who would never, ever let anyone else write her ending again. I spent that first day back, quietly observing everything. My mother's soft humming as she prepared breakfast. The way the sunlight slanted across the kitchen tiles I'd once taken for granted. It felt surreal, like living inside a memory I knew by heart. But this time, I was the only one aware of what was coming. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about how it had all started. It wasn't the grand gestures that had trapped me. It was the small, insidious manipulations. The slow erosion of my confidence. The casual way he'd convinced me to trust him with my accounts, my business contacts, my future. I would never let him close enough to do it again. My phone buzzed, startling me. The name on the screen almost made me drop the cup. Ethan. He was the catalyst of everything. The man I'd loved so deeply I'd blinded myself to the truth. His message was simple, disarmingly casual. "Can I see you tonight?" I stared at the words. In my old life, I would have agreed immediately. I would have been flattered, thrilled, convinced he was finally serious about us. Now, I saw the move for what it was, a test to see if I was pliable, if I'd take the bait. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed a careful reply. "Maybe. I'm busy today. I'll let you know." I set the phone face down on the table, heart thumping. My mother looked up from her newspaper. "Everything okay?" she asked.
"Fine, elite."
"Just work." She nodded, unconcerned. Back then, I'd never told her how involved Ethan was in my company. How much power I'd given him. Part of me wanted to warn her, to confess everything, but I knew she wouldn't believe me. Not yet. I needed proof first. That meant playing along. Pretending I was still the same trusting girl he'd preyed on. And that meant meeting him tonight just like before, but this time with my eyes open. After breakfast, I retreated to my room and opened the old laptop I'd stored in the closet. In my past life, it had held all my business plans, contracts, and confidential records. It would again, but this time, the information would be weaponized. I spent hours creating hidden folders, backing up files, and setting up tracking on every email account linked to my business. If he tried to access anything, I'd know. Around noon, a text from my best friend, Lila, lit up the screen. Lunch today? I miss you. My throat tightened. Lila had been the only one who tried to warn me about Ethan. She'd seen the way he isolated me, how he made me doubt my instincts. I'd pushed her away, convinced she just didn't understand our love. Guilt twisted in my stomach. I couldn't change the way I'd treated her before, but I could make it right now. Absolutely, I texted back. You pick the place. When I arrived at our favorite cafe an hour later, Lila was already there, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in so long. I realized how much I'd missed her. Hey, stranger, she teased. You've been quiet lately. I took a deep breath and sat down. Yeah. A lot's been on my mind. She studied me, her expression shifting to concern. Is it Ethan? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Kind of. I'm reevaluating a lot of things. Lila's eyes softened. You know I'm here, right? No matter what. I know. My voice wavered. Thank you. For the first time since waking up in the second chance, I felt something like hope. Over lunch, she filled me in on everything I'd forgotten, small details I could use. Who was dating whom? Which investors were circling my company? Which gossip Ethan would eventually use to undermine me? I listened intently, storing every scrap of information. When we finally stood to leave, she hugged me so tightly, I thought my ribs might crack. Don't let him change you, she whispered. Too late for that, I thought. But not in the way she meant. Back home, I paced my room, rehearsing what I'd say to Ethan. How I'd pretend to be naive just a little longer. How I'd watch his every move. Because this time, he wouldn't destroy me. This time, I was the one with all the power. By the time evening came, I felt almost eerily calm. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a soft blue dress I used to wear on dates with him. The one he'd once said made me look innocent. Back then, I'd blushed at the compliment. Now, it was part of my camouflage. I checked the mirror one last time, studying my reflection for any sign of the old me. My eyes looked different, sharper, as if they'd seen too much to ever soften again. Satisfied, I grabbed my purse and headed out. Ethan had chosen a trendy rooftop bar downtown. When I arrived, he was already waiting, leaning against the railing with that polished, effortless confidence I'd fallen for. Even knowing what I knew now, my heart gave a traitorous lurch at the sight of him. I swallowed it down. He wasn't the man I'd loved. He was the architect of my ruin. He turned, smiling, and pushed off the railing to kiss my cheek. His cologne was exactly the same, crisp, expensive. I forced myself to smile back. You look beautiful, he said, sliding his hand down my arm. I missed you. I studied his face, wondering how I'd ever thought he was sincere. Every line of his expression was practiced, every touch calculated. Thank you, I murmured. You look good too. We sat at a table near the glass railing. The city lights flickered below us, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then I remembered how this night had ended the first time, how he'd coaxed me to sign a document that would later be used to strip my business away. Not tonight. As the waiter took our order, Ethan reached across the table to twine his fingers with mine. You've been distant lately, he said. His tone was casual, but I caught the faint edge beneath it. Is something wrong? I tilted my head, feigning confusion. Wrong? No. I've just been busy. He studied me for a long moment. I could see him weighing how much pressure to apply. In my old life, he'd have cajoled me into confessing every private thought. He'd have made me feel guilty for even considering my own boundaries. But now, I was the one in control of this conversation. That's understandable, he finally said, giving my hand a little squeeze. I was hoping we could talk about the future. My stomach flipped, but I forced my expression to stay neutral. Here comes, I thought. In what way? I asked carefully. He smiled, and it was so practiced it made my skin crawl. I've been thinking about your company, about how we could work more closely together. I almost laughed. He was so predictable it was insulting. That's interesting, I said, pretending to consider it. What did you have in mind? He launched into a polished pitch. Some nonsense about merging our resources, consolidating assets. I nodded along, filing every detail away for later. He didn't realize that I already knew exactly where this would lead if I let it. Bankruptcy, humiliation, isolation. But the most infuriating part was how certain he was that I would agree. When he finally paused to sip his drink, I smiled sweetly. I appreciate you thinking of me, I said. Can I look over the details and get back to you? Of course. He looked pleased, as if he'd already won. I excused myself to the restroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. It was almost exhilarating to stand across from him and pretend to be oblivious. I took out my phone and typed a quick note, documenting everything he'd said. Evidence. I would build a whole arsenal of it, just in case he tried to claim later that I'd agreed to anything. When I came back to the table, I schooled my features into something soft and agreeable. He didn't suspect a thing. After another hour, we parted ways. He hugged me, whispered that he was excited about our future, and I nodded as if I shared the sentiment. As soon as his car disappeared into the night, I let my smile drop. The truth was he'd already lost. He just didn't know it yet. I turned and walked toward my own car, feeling stronger with every step. This time, I was ready. This time, he would regret ever underestimating me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, memories collided with my thoughts, snippets of conversations, the echo of Ethan's voice telling me I was nothing without him. The moment I'd signed the papers, he dangled like salvation. But in the darkness, a new feeling burned brighter than the fear. Purpose. I got up before dawn, unable to stand lying still any longer. In the quiet kitchen, I made coffee and opened my laptop. The screen's glow felt like a beacon calling me back to life. I started a fresh document and titled it simply, Operation Resurrection. Every detail, I remembered, every name, every date. I typed them out line by line. It felt almost ceremonial, reclaiming my story in black and white. I wrote until the sun rose and the sky turned pale pink. When I finally leaned back in my chair, my fingers were cramped, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. One name stood out among all the others. Adrian Wolfe. In my first life, Adrian had been Ethan's biggest rival. Where Ethan was smooth and charming, Adrian was cold and ruthless. He'd built his empire from nothing, and rumor said he had enough dirt on every major player in the city to topple them all if he wanted. I'd met him only once, during a charity gala Ethan had dragged me to. He'd barely looked at me, his expression carved from ice. But he'd known exactly who I was, and more importantly, who Ethan was. I remembered the faint contempt in his eyes as he'd watched Ethan gloat about a new partnership. At the time, I'd been too starry-eyed to notice the way Adrian had seen right through him. Now, though, I wondered if he'd be willing to help me dismantle the man we both hated. The thought was dangerous, and part of me knew it. Aligning myself with someone like Adrian would mean stepping into a world even darker than the one I'd just escaped. But if I was serious about revenge, I couldn't do it alone. And besides, the memory of Adrian's cool gaze lingered in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. I shut the laptop and went to shower, letting the hot water ground me. By the time I dressed and did my hair, I had made a decision. I would reach out to him. If I could convince Adrian Wolfe that I was worth his time and his resources, I could expose Ethan faster than I ever could on my own. The idea both terrified and thrilled me. Downstairs, my mother was already bustling around the kitchen. She glanced up as I entered, her eyes crinkling with that familiar warmth. For a second, I almost faltered, because she hadn't betrayed me yet. She was still the woman who fussed over my breakfast and asked if I was getting enough sleep. But I couldn't forget how quickly she turned her back when Ethan convinced her I was unstable. How she'd chosen his lies over my truth. I sat across from her and forced a smile.
Morning.
Morning, sweetheart. Big plans today. I stirred my coffee, careful to keep my tone neutral. Just catching up on some things. She hesitated, as if she wanted to ask more, but then seemed to think better of it. After breakfast, I slipped out and drove to the small office I'd rented years ago, before I'd merged everything into Ethan's operations. The lease was still in my name, a tiny blessing I hadn't realized I'd need. The space was dusty and stale, but as I stepped inside, it felt like the first step toward reclaiming my independence. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning, organizing, setting up my old equipment. By the time I was done, it looked almost respectable. Sitting at the desk, I composed a short, direct email to Adrian Wolfe's assistant. Subject: Proposal for collaboration message. Mr. Wolfe, my name is Evelina Hart. I believe we share a mutual interest in the activities of Ethan Black. I have information that may be of value to you. If you're willing to meet, I can explain further.
Yeech.
My finger hovered over the send button. One click would set everything in motion. There would be no going back. I pressed send. As the message disappeared into the ether, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The girl I used to be had died, and the woman in her place was ready for war. The hours after I sent that email crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse spiked, only to sink again when it was just a notification or spam. By late afternoon, I was pacing the length of my office, replaying every word I'd written, wondering if I'd sounded too desperate or too vague. But just as the sun started to dip behind the rooftops, my phone finally rang. I froze, staring at the screen. Unknown number. I answered on the second ring, forcing my voice to stay calm. Hello. A woman's voice, smooth and clipped, spoke. MS. Heart. Mr. Wolf has received your message. He's agreed to meet with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. at his offices. My throat went dry. Thank you. He expects punctuality. Of course. The call ended without another word. I stood there for a long moment, the silence ringing in my ears. My heart felt like it was trying to pound its way out of my chest. This was real now. I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. I could do this. I had to. I packed up my laptop and drove home, trying to calm the riot in my head. I spent the evening going over everything I planned to say, every fact, every document, every timeline. If Adrian Wolf was going to help me, he'd need to see that I was prepared, not just some emotional wreck looking for retribution. When I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion pulled me under like a tide. I dreamed of the night everything had fallen apart. The screaming, the papers shoved into my hands, Ethan's voice as cold as the marble floors beneath my knees. But this time, in the dream, I stood up. I tore the contracts in half. I looked him in the eye and said, "You don't own me." When I woke, it was still dark, but something in me felt steadier. I dressed with care. Black trousers, a soft cream blouse, a blazer that made me look older, more serious. I pulled my hair into a low twist and applied makeup sparingly. The woman in the mirror didn't look fragile. She looked like she was ready to take back her life. On the drive downtown, I rehearsed my introduction over and over. By the time I pulled into the private parking garage below Adrian Wolf's glass tower, I almost felt numb. The lobby was hushed, elegant. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, enormous modern art installations I didn't understand. The receptionist didn't even ask my name. She just gestured to the private elevator and murmured, "Top floor." I stepped inside the elevator, feeling it glide up so smoothly I barely sensed the movement. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a spacious office bathed in morning light. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the skyline. Sleek shelves lined with books and awards. A massive desk of black stone. And behind that desk, Adrian Wolf. He was exactly as I remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. His hair was dark, cut neatly at the sides, and his eyes were the pale gray of storm clouds. He didn't stand when I entered, just studied me in silence. "Miss Hart," he said finally, his voice as cool as his gaze. "Have a seat." I walked forward, my heels tapping against the polished floor, and lowered myself into the chair across from him. Up close, he was even more intimidating. There was no warmth in his expression, no softness in his posture, just the faintest glimmer of curiosity, as if he was dissecting me already. "You claim you have information regarding Ethan Black," he said without preamble. "I do." He leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "You'll forgive me if I'm skeptical. You were his companion, were you not? For several years?" His choice of words made my stomach twist, but I kept my expression neutral. I was. And during that time, I witnessed and documented more than he ever realized. His eyebrow lifted. Documented. I reached into my bag and removed the slim folder I'd prepared. These are just a few of the records I retained. Financial transactions, shell companies, falsified contracts. I set it on the desk, my hand steady. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible between us. Finally, he spoke. "And why, exactly, are you bringing this to me?" "Because you want to destroy him," I said quietly. "And so do I." His gaze sharpened. The air between us felt charged, electric. "I'm not interested in helping someone settle a personal vendetta," he said. I met his eyes, without flinching. "This isn't just personal. Ethan Black is a fraud. He's been siphoning money from investors, laundering funds through foreign accounts, and blackmailing anyone who gets in his way. If you want evidence, I have it." He studied me in silence. Then, at last, he reached for the folder. I watched as he flipped it open, scanning the first few pages. His expression didn't change, but I sensed a subtle shift in the air, something like interest. When he looked up, his gaze was assessing. "You have more of this?" "Yes." "Then you'll bring it to me," he said. "All of it." I nodded slowly. "In return," he continued, his voice low, "I'll consider assisting you." It wasn't a promise, but it was the first crack in Ethan's fortress. And that was all I needed. I left Adrian Wolf's office feeling like I'd survived an interrogation. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I sagged against the wall, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. He hadn't exactly agreed to help me, but the fact that he'd asked for more meant he was intrigued. And intrigue was leverage. By the time I reached my car, adrenaline had given way to exhaustion. But I couldn't afford to stop. If Adrian was going to take me seriously, I had to prove I wasn't just another scorned woman with a grudge. I drove straight to my office. As soon as I sat down, I pulled up the rest of my files. Scans of bank statements, internal memos, hidden ledgers I'd managed to salvage before everything collapsed. For hours, I cross-checked the data, organizing it into folders. Every page felt like a vindication, proof that I hadn't been crazy, that Ethan had been lying to me from the very start. When dusk finally fell, I compiled everything onto an encrypted flash drive. I held it in my palm for a long moment. So small. So ordinary. Yet the evidence inside could bring down the man who thought he was untouchable. I slipped it into my purse, locked up the office, and walked out into the twilight. Driving home, my mind was strangely quiet.
No doubts.
No fear. Just a steady certainty that this was the only path left to me. The next morning, I sent Adrian's assistant a short message confirming I'd assembled the documentation. Within 10 minutes, she replied with a time and an address. Different from the office tower, this time a discreet townhouse in the old quarter of the city. I wondered if that was where Adrian conducted business. He didn't want traced back to his official operations. Good. That meant he was taking this seriously. I spent the rest of the day reviewing everything again, refusing to let my nerves get the better of me. But when night fell, I lay awake in my bed, replaying the meeting in my head. His eyes. The way they'd stripped me bare in an instant. I hated how I remembered the exact cadence of his voice. The chill in it. The way it had made something in me shiver that had nothing to do with fear. I buried my face in my pillow and forced the thought away.
This wasn't about him.
This was about justice.
But somewhere deep inside, I knew it was about more than that too.
The next evening, I parked outside the townhouse. From the street, it looked unremarkable, red brick, ivy climbing the walls. But when I rang the bell, the door opened to a polished foyer with dark wood floors and soft lighting. The same assistant led me inside without a word. Adrian was waiting in a sitting room that looked more like a private library. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and glass cases of curiosities I didn't dare examine. He rose when I entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hart," he said, gesturing to a low table. "Sit." I took the seat opposite him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "Do you have it?" I set the flash drive on the table between us. "Everything you asked for." He didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze steady on mine. "You understand that by giving me this, you're implicating yourself," he said. "I know." My voice didn't waver. "But I'd rather risk everything than let him do it to someone else." A flicker of something, respect, maybe, passed over his face. "Why come to me?" he asked softly. "You could have gone to the authorities." I took a breath. Ethan has connections everywhere. Lawyers. Investigators on his payroll. I needed someone he couldn't manipulate. "And you think that's me?" "Yes." The silence between us stretched, weighted with things I couldn't name. Finally, he reached for the flash drive. "I'll verify this. If it's legitimate, you'll have my assistance." I nodded, feeling the knot in my chest loosen, just slightly. He slipped the drive into his jacket pocket. "Be aware," he continued, his tone measured, "that if you lie to me, there will be consequences." "I'm not lying." He studied me for another moment, then inclined his head. "Then we'll speak soon." It wasn't a dismissal, but I understood the implication. The meeting was over. I stood, my legs almost trembling. As I walked toward the door, his voice stopped me. "Miss Hart." I turned. His expression was still composed, but something in his eyes had shifted, something I couldn't quite read. "If you're going to wage a war against Ethan Black," he said quietly, "you'd better be prepared to burn everything down." I held his gaze without flinching. "I already have." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I turned and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was crisp and cool. I drew in a deep breath that tasted like freedom. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't face it alone. The days that followed passed in a haze of anticipation. I didn't hear from Adrian or his assistant, and part of me wondered if he decided to bury my evidence, or worse, hand it back to Ethan as leverage. But whenever the doubt threatened to consume me, I forced myself to remember the look in Adrian's eyes when I'd said I'd rather risk everything. It hadn't been pity. It had been recognition. By the fourth day, I couldn't bear waiting any longer. I threw myself into work, reconnecting with old contacts I'd lost touch with in my last life. Some of them were wary, unsure why I was suddenly interested in re-establishing relationships. But I was patient. I knew it would take time to rebuild my credibility. Late one afternoon, my phone rang. When I saw the number, my breath caught. Miss Hart. Adrian's voice was as smooth and cold as ever. I've reviewed your documentation. And it's thorough, he said after a pause. More than I expected. Relief flooded through me so abruptly, my knees nearly buckled. You said you wanted my assistance, he continued. If you still do, I have a proposal. I forced my voice to stay calm.
I'm listening.
Meet me tonight. 8 o'clock. The same townhouse. Before I could respond, he ended the call. I stared at the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. I knew better than to trust him fully. Adrian Wolfe wasn't known for charity. But he was also the only person with the power and the willingness to take Ethan down. That night, I dressed in the same cream blouse and black trousers as before. Part of me wondered if it was foolish to keep meeting him alone, but I reminded myself that I wasn't the naive girl Ethan had broken. I was the woman who'd come back from the dead. When I arrived, Adrian's assistant led me to the same library. He was already standing by the windows, looking out over the city lights. For a moment, he didn't turn, and I wondered if he even realized I was there. Finally, he spoke without looking at me.
Seat.
I obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair. He turned then, and the intensity in his gaze made me want to look away. But I didn't. I've confirmed the validity of your files, he said. With them, I could have Ethan Black indicted within a month. My breath caught. But, he continued, his tone hardening, destroying him outright would also damage your name, Miss Hart. You were listed as a co-signer on many of these transactions. Whether you were complicit or not, you'll be implicated. I swallowed. I understand. His gaze sharpened. Do you? I forced myself to hold his stare. If that's the price, I'll pay it. Something flickered across his expression, gone so quickly I couldn't name it. There may be another way, he said. What do you mean? He moved to the table and retrieved a slim black folder. When he set it in front of me, I hesitated before opening it. Inside were printouts, corporate documents, shell company ledgers, contracts I didn't recognize. What is this? I asked slowly. Evidence, he said, of Ethan's most recent acquisition. I skimmed the documents, realization dawning. He wasn't just embezzling. He was using stolen funds to buy a controlling stake in one of Adrian's subsidiaries. He's trying to leverage this against you, I whispered. Adrian inclined his head. Which is why I'm willing to help you, provided you help me in return. I looked up, my heart thudding. You want an alliance. Call it what you like, he said calmly. We share a common enemy. You have knowledge I don't, and I have resources you lack. And when he's ruined? He didn't blink. Then our association ends. I let out a slow breath. Part of me had hoped. For what, I wasn't sure. Gratitude? Camaraderie? But Adrian Wolfe wasn't a man who formed friendships. Still, I nodded. All right. What do you need me to do? His mouth curved, not quite a smile. First, you'll compile a list of every person Ethan has bribed or blackmailed. Every weak link in his chain. If we're going to dismantle him, we'll do it methodically. And after that? He paused, studying me as if he could see the shadows of everything I'd endured. After that, he said quietly, you'll decide whether you want to disappear from this world or rule it. My breath caught. I thought of the girl I'd been. The one who believed love was enough, the one who trusted too easily and paid the price. I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to rise. I met his gaze steadily. I'll get you the list. He inclined his head. Good. We'll meet again in 3 days. I stood, my legs steadier than I expected. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me once more. Miss Hart. I looked back. For what it's worth, he said, his tone almost imperceptibly softer. I don't think you're weak. I didn't know how to respond. So, I simply nodded and walked out into the night. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a baptism. And for the first time since I'd woken in my old bed, I felt alive. I barely remembered the drive home. My mind was too full of possibilities, dangerous, electrifying possibilities. An alliance with Adrian Wolfe was a risk, but so was doing nothing. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I didn't let myself lie in bed and second-guess the decision I'd already made. Instead, I showered, dressed, and brewed strong coffee, feeling the steady thrum of purpose in my veins. If I was going to give Adrian the names he wanted, I needed to be meticulous. I started with the obvious. The people I'd watched Ethan manipulate firsthand, the junior accountants he'd bribed, the board members he'd blackmailed with secrets. But as the list grew, I realized how much I'd ignored in my old life. How many conversations I'd overheard but never questioned. When I paused to rub my eyes, it was already late afternoon. My phone buzzed with a message from Lila. Haven't heard from you in a few days. Are you okay? Guilt stabbed through me. I'd promised myself I wouldn't shut her out again, but I couldn't tell her what I was doing. Not yet. I'm fine, I typed back. Just working on something important. I'll call you soon, I promise. I set the phone aside and forced myself to focus. By the time dusk fell, I had 37 names. Some I knew Ethan had targeted personally. Others I suspected, based on things I'd pieced together. I saved the list in an encrypted file and backed it up to a flash drive. When I finally pushed away from the desk, my shoulders ached. But I felt something close to satisfaction. I wasn't the girl sitting in Ethan's penthouse, waiting for scraps of affection. I was the woman who'd outlived him once. And now I was coming for him. The next morning, I drove to the townhouse. Adrian's assistant met me at the door, her expression as inscrutable as ever. This way, she said, leading me back to the library. Adrian was seated in the same chair, reviewing a thick sheaf of papers. When I entered, he looked up, and for a moment, our eyes locked in a silent understanding. I set the flash drive on the table between us. Every name I could remember, I said. Some are confirmed. Others are likely, based on what I witnessed. He didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, he watched me with that unsettling stillness. You understand that once we begin, there's no returning to the life you had, he said quietly. I met his gaze. There's nothing in that life worth going back to. His mouth curved, the faintest hint of a smile that never touched his eyes. Very well, he murmured. He picked up the drive, slipped it into his pocket, and gestured to the chair opposite. Sit, he said. There are details we need to discuss. I lowered myself into the seat, heart thrumming. For this to succeed, he began, we must strike from multiple angles. Financial, legal, reputational. While I dismantle his holdings, you'll feed misinformation to his closest allies. Enough to make them question his stability. I nodded slowly, and when he tries to retaliate, his eyes glinted, cold, and almost amused. He won't get the chance. A chill danced down my spine. I didn't doubt for a moment that Adrian meant it. He continued outlining the plan, how my knowledge would be used to trigger audits, how his team would leak damning evidence to regulators and the press. Every step was precise, surgical. When he finally paused, I realized I'd been holding my breath. You understand your role, he said. Yes. And you accept the consequences. I do. He studied me for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Ethan Black underestimated you, he said. He saw only what you allowed him to see. Something in my chest twisted. And what do you see? Asked before I could stop myself. His gaze never wavered. A woman who is more dangerous than she realizes. Heat bloomed low in my stomach, startling and unwelcome. I looked away, focusing on the dark grain of the table. I'll do whatever it takes, I said softly. I know, he replied. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, taut with something I didn't dare name. Finally, he straightened, his expression cooling again. Be ready, he said. When this begins, it will move quickly. I nodded and stood, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. As I reached the door, he spoke once more. Miss Hart. I paused, glancing back. You've already won more than you realize, he said. Most people never escape the cage they build for themselves. I didn't trust myself to answer. Instead, I slipped into the hall, heart thundering in my chest. Outside, the night air wrapped around me like a promise. This time, I wasn't going to survive Ethan Black. I was going to bury him. The first strike came 3 days later. I was sitting in my office, pretending to answer emails, when my phone lit up with a news alert. Black and Hart Holdings under investigation for fraud allegations. I stared at the headline, my pulse roaring in my ears. It had begun. Over the next hour, the story spread like wildfire. Every business outlet picked it up, each article more damning than the last. They quoted anonymous sources, Adrian sources I knew, claiming Ethan had falsified earnings, siphoned investor funds, and bribed regulators to keep it buried. My phone buzzed constantly. Old contacts, board members, even distant acquaintances, all wanting to know if I knew what was happening. I ignored them all, because there was only one call I was waiting for. When the screen finally flashed Ethan, my breath caught. I waited just long enough to be sure he'd wonder if I'd pick up before answering. Hello.
Eve.
His voice was tight, brittle. Where are you? At the office, I said evenly. You've seen the news. I have. There was a pause. You know this is all lies, don't you? You know me. Once, those words would have gutted me. Once, I would have rushed to reassure him, to promise I believed every denial. But not anymore. I don't know you at all, I said quietly. His breath hissed out. You think you're safe? You think whoever is feeding this garbage to the press won't turn on you next? You're named in half these documents. I closed my eyes. Maybe. But I'd rather be ruined on my own terms than live as your puppet. For a moment, there was only silence. When he spoke again, his voice was low, cold. "You'll regret this." I swallowed, steadying myself.
No.
"You will." Then I ended the call. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. That evening I met Adrian again. This time, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He gestured to a seat and slid a folder across the table. "Your company's board has scheduled an emergency meeting. They'll try to remove you to contain the damage." I nodded. I expected that. His gaze sharpened. "Are you prepared to fight them?" I thought of the contracts I'd signed, the trust I'd given so blindly. "Yes." "Good." He leaned back, studying me with that cool, assessing stare. "You've done well," he said finally. The praise startled me. "Thank you." He didn't smile, but something flickered behind his eyes, something almost like approval. "I've arranged for legal counsel," he continued. "You'll meet them tomorrow. They'll help you navigate the fallout." "And Ethan?" "He's scrambling," Adrian said, a faint edge of satisfaction in his voice. He didn't expect the scope of this. "He'll lash out. Be ready." "I am." He inclined his head. "You'll need to be more than ready, Miss Hart. You'll need to be ruthless." I thought of the woman I used to be. The woman who'd believed in forgiveness, in second chances, in the possibility that love could fix what ambition had broken. That woman was gone. "I understand," I said. His gaze held mine, and for a moment, the air between us hummed with something unspoken. Then he stood. "This is the last time we'll meet here," he said. "From now on, communication goes through my assistant. For your protection." I rose, heart thudding. "All right." As I turned to leave, he caught my wrist. His grip was firm, but not unkind. "Evelina," he said, and the use of my first name sent a strange jolt through me. I looked up startled. "Don't let him see you afraid," he said quietly. "I'm not," I whispered. He searched my face for a moment, then released me. "Good," he murmured. I walked out into the cold night, my skin still tingling where he touched me. Back in my car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I looked tired, but beneath the exhaustion, there was something new, something sharp and unbreakable. I drove home slowly, every mile feeling like another step away from the woman Ethan had tried to mold me into. When I pulled into the drive, my phone buzzed again. A single text from an unknown number. "You think you've won. But this isn't over." No name. No signature. But I didn't need either to know it was Ethan. I stared at the message, feeling a cold, quiet certainty settle over me. He was right. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the days that followed, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. My name appeared in headlines alongside Ethan's, tangled with words like fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. News vans camped outside my building. Former friends sent concerned texts I deleted without reading. But through it all, I didn't waver. Because I knew the truth. I wasn't the woman who had let herself be destroyed once. I was the woman who had come back to finish what he started. My first meeting with the legal team Adrian had arranged was held in a private conference room above a quiet cafe. The lawyers were polite but wary, as if they weren't sure what to make of me. But after 2 hours of questions, where I explained every signature, every conversation, every lie I could recall, the wariness shifted into something closer to respect. "You've documented more than most corporate investigators," one of them said. I almost smiled. "I've had time to prepare." Afterward, I stepped out into the early dusk. The city hummed around me, cars crawling along the avenues, neon signs flickering to life. I thought about the first time Ethan had brought me here. I'd been 23, so in love I'd believed anything he told me. I'd looked up at these same buildings and thought they were symbols of everything we could build together. Now they felt like reminders of what I'd lost and of what I would reclaim. My phone rang as I walked. Adrian's assistant, brisk and efficient. "Mr. Wolf would like an update." "Tell him the attorneys are moving forward," I said. "He also wanted you to know that the first wave of asset freezes has been approved. Ethan will receive notification in the morning." I exhaled, a shaky rush of relief. "Thank you." She hung up without another word. That night, I didn't go home. I drove instead to the edge of the city, to the old pier where I used to sit and think before everything went wrong. The air smelled of salt and cold steel. I stood there, watching the lights glint on the black water, feeling the enormity of what I'd set in motion. Ethan was going to lose everything he'd stolen. And for the first time, I was free. My phone buzzed again, a single text from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake. We could have had everything." I stared at the words, remembering the man I'd loved. "The man who taught me that love without respect is just a weapon waiting to be turned against you." "No," I typed back. "You were the mistake." I didn't wait for a reply. The next morning, The headlines were worse for him. Regulators seize Black and Hart Holdings assets amid expanding fraud investigation. Ethan Black declines to comment. My phone rang off the hook, but I ignored it all. Instead, I sat in my office, watching the light shift across the walls, feeling a quiet, steady satisfaction. Midday, Adrian called. This time, he didn't use his assistant. You did well, he said simply. I swallowed. It isn't over yet. No, he agreed. But the hardest part is. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything we'd both risked. You'll have enemies after this, he said finally. People who think you went too far. Maybe, I said. But I can live with that. His voice dropped to a low, almost thoughtful murmur. And what will you do now? I closed my eyes. I don't know, I admitted. But whatever it is, it will be my choice this time. For the first time, I heard a trace of warmth in his voice. Good. Another silence. Goodbye, Miss Hart. Goodbye, I said softly. When the call ended, I set the phone down and looked around my office. Once, this space had felt like a cage. Now it felt like a beginning. I picked up the framed photo on my desk, the last remnant of the woman I used to be, and turned it face down. Then I gathered my things and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. Outside, the city stretched vast and bright in every direction. I didn't know where I would go. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something like hope. I was reborn. And this time, no one would write my story but me.